Okay, so you know that feeling, right? When you want to like really understand something that's kind of complex, and you want to cut through the noise and all the jargon and like get right to the heart of it. Well, that's what we're trying to do here. And today we're going deep on something that's pretty fundamental to being human.
Yeah, definitely.
It's how we make sense of things,
Exactly.
from like books to our own experiences.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to do this, we're going to be talking about something called hermeneutics,
Right.
which might sound a bit intimidating, maybe like a word you'd find in a dusty textbook or something, but it's really just about interpretation.
It is.
Like the basic principles behind how we understand not just texts, but like the world around us, and even like each other.
Yeah, that's right.
And to help us with this, we've got some really interesting material to work with today.
Yeah, we do.
We've got a lecture from Yale that, really digs into the history of hermeneutics. And then we've got this paper from Birkbeck, University of London, on this thing called Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis,
Right.
or IPA for short.
IPA.
So our goal here is to kind of show you why these ideas that might seem kind of academic, are
Yeah.
actually super relevant to like how you experience and understand the world.
To your everyday life.
Yeah, every single day.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think one of the things to point out is that sometimes people think hermeneutics is like a new thing,
Yeah.
Like some new invention.
Right.
But it's actually
That's not.
not at all.
It's
ancient. It's
Yeah.
ancient. So the act of interpretation, like trying to understand things goes way, way back.
It does, yeah. And I mean, the Yale professor pointed out that like Aristotle,
Yes.
centuries ago,
Yeah.
wrote a whole work called De Interpretatione,
Right.
which is all about this.
It is, yeah.
And then the Middle Ages was full of these treatises about how to interpret things.
Right.
And, even before it became kind of a central concern in Christianity, you had really rich and elaborate Talmudic scholarship,
Yeah,
which was, at its heart, all about the principles of interpretation.
absolutely.
So this is not a new thing at all.
No, not at all.
It's just that the formal study of it has really kind of evolved,
Yeah, it's become more formalized over time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it has.
But the act itself is ancient.
It is, yeah,
Mm.
yeah. So I thought it was really interesting how the development of hermeneutics
Mm-hmm.
in the Western world anyway
Yeah.
was really tied to a specific historical event,
Mm-hmm.
the Protestant Reformation.
Exactly right.
So maybe can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah,
Like, before the Reformation, the Pope and the church leaders were kind of like the ultimate authority on what the Bible meant.
Yes, they were.
Right. So
Yeah.
the average person didn't really have to worry too much about interpreting it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They were told what it meant.
That's right, yeah.
And that was,
The meaning was decided for them
yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah.
And that's
it's
our
up, down.
system.
Yeah.
But then the Reformation changes everything because suddenly individuals are responsible for understanding Scripture.
Yeah, it's on them now.
Yeah.
Right?
On their own.
Yeah.
So that really
Huge.
made the process of interpretation both incredibly important but also
Way more complex.
more complex. Yeah, because it's not straightforward.
It's not.
Trying to understand
Right.
what these ancient parables mean
Yeah.
or passages mean is not easy.
No.
It's not at all.
It's no, and it's sacred scripture,
Yes.
So there's a lot at stake.
A lot at stake.
Right. People need to
Right.
feel like they're getting it right.
Yeah.
They're understanding the true meaning.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's really out of this kind of historical necessity
Yeah.
that the formal study of hermeneutics really took root in the West.
It did. Yeah.
But it didn't stop there.
It didn't stop at religious texts, did it?
No, it didn't.
Uh-huh.
It quickly moved into other domains as well.
It did, yeah.
And one of those domains was the law,
Okay.
particularly with the rise of constitutional democracies.
Right, because in a constitutional democracy, you've got these foundational documents,
Mhm.
like a constitution that,
Yeah.
need to be understood and applied.
Mhm.
And just like with, religious texts, there can be huge disagreements about what those words actually mean in practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we
Uh-huh.
see this all the time
Yeah.
with things like the U.S. Constitution, for example.
Yeah.
Ongoing debates about what
What does it really mean?
what it really means. What's the legitimate way to understand it?
Yeah,
These are questions that are still, fiercely debated today
they are.
in legal scholarship and
Yeah, and in courts.
the courts. Yeah,
Right. It's a huge deal.
it is.
So we've got religion,
Mhm.
then we've got law. But I thought it was really interesting that the Yale professor highlighted how literature was kind of a late addition to hermeneutics.
It was, yeah.
Like, why the delay? Why was literature so late to the party?
That's a great question. And it really has to do with how people viewed literature
Mm-hmm.
in earlier centuries. So if we go back to, say, the 18th century,
Okay.
the dominant view was that good writing should be clear and straightforward,
Okay.
like transparent almost.
Yeah, like the meaning is just
Right
obvious.
there on the surface.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea that you would need to interpret,
Yeah, if you have to interpret it, then it wasn't good writing.
it was seen as a flaw.
Yeah. Okay.
So in fact, like if you look at the prologues of plays from this era, playwrights would actually criticize each other
Oh, wow.
for being unclear and for requiring interpretation.
Wow.
So
Different view
totally different from
than like today where
we think about it now.
Yeah, where we celebrate like
Yeah.
the layers of meaning and
Yeah.
symbolism and stuff.
Complexity and ambiguity,
Yeah. Yeah. So what happened? What caused that shift?
Well, a big part of it was the rise of Romanticism,
Mm-hmm.
in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Okay.
And with Romanticism, you have the emergence of the cult of genius,
Mm-hmm.
which really emphasizes the unique mental and spiritual insights of the author,
Okay.
right? So the meaning of literature then becomes potentially very, very personal and not necessarily accessible to everyone immediately.
Right. So it's not just like clear transparency anymore. It's like the author has this special insight.
Right.
And maybe it's expressed in ways that are challenging to understand.
Yeah.
Like you've got to really uncover that meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And if we connect this to the broader context of the Enlightenment and the increasing secularization of Western culture,
Mm-hmm.
literature starts to kind of take on this role of what some have called secular scripture.
Secular scripture.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah. So it starts to kind of fill some of the space left by the declining authority of religion
Yeah.
for some people.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So if literature is becoming this kind of important thing that maybe is hard to understand, on the surface, that's when we really start to see a need for hermeneutics of literature.
Exactly right.
Yeah, okay.
And so one of the figures who was really central to this was Friedrich Schleiermacher,
Okay.
who was a very important theologian of the Romantic era.
Mm-hmm.
And Schleiermacher really focused on developing principles of hermeneutics that could be applied to literature
Okay.
as well as scripture.
So he's kind of expanding the scope.
Expanding the scope.
Yeah.
And after Schleiermacher, we have other important figures like Wilhelm Dilthey
Mm-hmm.
around the turn of the 20th century, and then Heidegger, of course,
Yeah.
is a very influential work, Being in Time, which was published in 1927,
Mm-hmm.
and then Gadamer,
Yeah.
who was a student of Heidegger,
Mm-hmm.
and so all of these figures
Yeah.
really, help to develop and refine the field of hermeneutics,
Yeah.
especially in relation to literature and, just understanding in general.
Yeah.
So this kind of brings us to one of I think, the most central and really fascinating ideas in hermeneutics,
Okay.
which is the hermeneutic circle.
The hermeneutic circle. So this is something that comes up all the time. It does, yeah. When we talk about interpretation.
Mhm.
So maybe just in its most basic form, can you kind of explain what the hermeneutic circle is?
Sure. So at its core, the hermeneutic circle describes the relationship between a reader and a text,
Okay.
right? However, it's worth noting that some scholars like E.D. Hirsch
Mm-hmm.
view it primarily as a relationship between a reader and the author,
Okay.
right?
So the reader is trying to get into the author's head
Exactly.
through the text.
Yeah. So the text is kind of like a vessel that contains the author's meaning. And the goal then is to sort of extract that meaning,
Mm-hmm.
right? To understand what the author intended to say.
Okay.
But Gadamer's view is a little bit different.
Okay, so Gadamer's view is a little different. So what's his key distinction there?
Yeah, so for Gadamer, the hermeneutic circle is often understood as the interplay between the part and the whole of a text.
Okay.
Right. So when we approach a text,
Mm-hmm.
we first encounter individual elements, right?
Yeah.
Like a word,
Okay.
a phrase, a sentence.
Yeah.
And even though that's just a small part,
Mm-hmm.
we immediately begin to form a kind of preliminary idea or expectation about the overall meaning of the text.
So that initial glimpse of a part shapes your guess about the big picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
as we continue to read,
Mm-hmm.
subsequent parts,
Yeah.
lines, paragraphs, chapters,
Okay.
we're constantly referring back to that evolving sense of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the crucial thing.
Okay.
As we encounter more details, our understanding of the whole also changes.
It does.
So it's a back and forth process.
So it's not like a one-way street.
Yeah.
It's this constant movement.
It is.
Right. You use the whole to interpret the parts, but then the parts change your understanding of the whole.
Exactly. It's circular.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it is.
And I like to think of it as kind of like an ongoing conversation.
Okay.
Where, our initial assumptions about the whole inform how we see the individual details, but then those details kind of reshape our view of the whole.
It's like this constant dance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Gadamer actually extends this idea beyond just texts.
Okay.
So he sees this kind of circularity at play and the relationship between the present and the past.
Okay.
Like our current historical perspective is always interacting with the historical context of a text, right? But it also applies to conversations, whether it's across, social or cultural or even just, interpersonal divides.
Yeah.
We're constantly trying to understand what the other person is saying
Right.
in relation to our own perspective.
Yeah.
And that kind of mutual understanding develops in this kind of back and forth manner as well.
Yeah, so with this idea of the hermeneutic circle, it seems like you can never really approach anything with a totally blank slate.
Right.
You're always bringing your own background and experiences to the table, and that kind of raises a potential concern, right?
It does.
Like, what about bias?
Yeah, what about bias?
If you're always coming at things with your own pre-existing ideas,
right.
How can you ever really understand something objectively?
Yeah, that's a central question in hermeneutics.
It is, yeah.
And, Heidegger and Gadamer both address this head on.
Okay.
And they argue that we simply cannot avoid having preliminary understandings.
Okay.
Right? And Gadamer actually used the term prejudices.
Prejudices. Okay, now that's a word that,
Yeah.
Usually has a lot of negative baggage.
Yeah, it does. It does.
So how do we understand that in this context?
So Gadamer was very aware of those negative connotations, right? But he was using the term more in its original sense of just prejudgment or prior judgment.
Okay, so it's not like prejudice in the way we
Not in the
interpret it today, yeah?
not in the pejorative sense necessarily, but just the idea that we always have.
You've got to come at it with something.
We have to come at it with something.
Right, yeah.
So we always have some kind of initial understanding, some set of assumptions.
Right.
When we encounter something new.
So the question isn't how do we get rid of prejudice? It's
what do we do with it?
Yeah, like how do we engage with it?
Right. How do we engage with it productively?
Right, yeah, okay.
And so this is where Heidegger's idea of the two ways into the circle becomes really helpful.
Yeah.
Right. He argues that the hermeneutic circle isn't necessarily a vicious circle.
Okay.
Right. Like this kind of endless, unproductive loop. It can actually be constructive.
Okay.
And so one way into the circle is by drawing our interpretation from the thing itself.
Oh.
Right. So letting the text.
So letting it
guide us.
guide your understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. The other way, which is less productive, is to kind of force the thing into pre-existing categories.
Yeah.
That might not be appropriate.
Right. Okay. So it's the difference between being open to what something's actually saying and just trying to fit it into your own preformed ideas.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. And the Yale professor gave this great example about the word plastic.
So he did. Yeah.
So
it's a good example.
Like in Mark Akenside's 18th century poem, right?
Yeah.
He has this line that says, "The great creator raised his plastic arm."
Right.
And to a modern leader, that might sound really strange.
It would, yeah.
Because we immediately think of...
We think of plastic bags.
Plastic bags and,
Yeah, or cosmetic surgery.
Cosmetic surgery.
Right. So that's an example of kind of less helpful prejudice.
Yeah.
Where we're just applying our present-day understanding without considering the historical context.
Right, yeah. So it just sounds totally out of place if you...
Yeah.
Think of plastic the way we do today.
It does, yeah.
Yeah,
but if you have the prejudice or the prior knowledge that in the 18th century, plastic often meant malleable or formative or easily shaped, then the line makes perfect sense.
It does.
The great creator raised his formative arm.
Yeah.
It fits beautifully.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Right.
Yeah. So that really highlights this difference between... a helpful and a less helpful preconception.
Yeah, and the constructive versus vicious circle.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Now, the Yale professor also talked about Gadamer's critique of something called historicism.
He did, yes.
So what was that all about?
So Gadamer was very opposed to historicism, which in this context refers to the belief that you can completely set aside your own preconceptions and your own subjectivity to understand the past objectively.
Okay, so it's the idea that you can be like a totally neutral observer.
Exactly.
You can just kind of strip away all your own biases and see the past as it truly was.
Exactly.
Right. And Gadamer's saying, no, you can't do that.
He says that's simply not possible.
Okay.
We are always
Yeah.
situated within our own historical horizon.
Okay.
Our own way of seeing and understanding the world, which is shaped by our present-day experiences and knowledge.
Right.
So instead of trying to eliminate that horizon, Gadamer proposes what he calls horizon merger.
Horizon merger.
Or in German, Horizonverschmelzung.
Okay, I like that. Yeah.
And he kind of uses this analogy of like two different landscapes meeting in the horizon line.
Yeah.
Right? They remain distinct, but there's a point of connection.
Okay, so it's about trying to find common ground.
Yes.
Right, between our perspective and the perspective of the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the goal isn't to become someone from the past. It's to try to find what Gadamer calls effective history.
Effective history.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does that mean?
So effective history is history that is relevant and can teach us something.
Okay, so instead of just like memorizing historical dates,
Right.
it's about engaging with the past in a way that's meaningful for us today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Gadamer actually suggests that there's something a little bit, maybe condescending about historicism.
Okay.
Because it can kind of treat the past as merely an object of study.
Yeah, just like a thing to analyze.
Rather than a source of potential wisdom or insight.
Yeah.
And he thinks that we should be open to being taught by the past.
Okay.
Rather than just analyzing it from a distance.
Right, so it's not just a monologue from the present. It's more like a dialogue.
It's a dialogue.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, okay, now Heidegger also had some pretty interesting things to say about interpretation. Right.
He did. Yeah.
Like how it's always happening.
It's always happening.
Yeah.
So in Being and Time, he argues that interpretation isn't just something we do. When we encounter like complex texts or philosophical ideas,
Right.
it's fundamental to even our most basic perceptions.
Okay.
He uses the example of seeing an exit sign.
Okay.
Right? We don't just see a collection of shapes.
Right.
We immediately interpret it.
Yeah, we see it as an exit sign.
We see it as an exit.
Yeah.
And that implies a way out, a direction to go in case of emergency.
Right.
And Heidegger suggests that it would be very difficult.
Almost impossible to just see something without seeing it as something.
Right. You can't just see the shapes.
Yeah.
Without that meaning.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, so the first movement of mind, he says, is interpretative.
It is.
Right.
Yeah.
We're always already making sense of the world around us.
So we're never just passively observing.
Right.
We're always actively trying to understand things.
We're making sense of things.
Yeah, based on what we already know.
Based on what we already know.
Yeah. Okay, and that really connects back to this idea that interpreters always work with these preconceptions and foreunderstandings.
Right. And as we talked about earlier, Gadamer, while acknowledging those negative connotations of the word prejudice, really emphasized its original meaning of prejudgment.
Yeah.
Right. And he argued that this kind of prior understanding is unavoidable and that the Enlightenment's prejudice against prejudice, the idea that we can achieve pure objectivity is itself a kind of prejudice.
It is. Yeah. It's a prejudice.
It's
a prejudgment.
It's prejudgment, right.
That you can be totally objective.
That you can be totally objective, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now we should also say that, the Yale professor also reminded us that prejudices can be, harmful.
It can be.
Right.
Right.
Like in the, the more negative sense.
For that word.
In the pejorative sense.
Yeah. And he gives the example of how slavery was viewed within, the classical tradition, right?
Right.
And how just accepting tradition without really critically thinking about it can lead to, really unjust beliefs and practices.
Yes, it can.
Right. So it's a reminder that while you can't escape these prejudgments, you still have to...
We have to scrutinize them.
Yeah.
We have to...
critically examine them.
Examine them, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the awareness is important, but the reflection on those preconceptions is also important.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, now, uh, the professor also drew a distinction between Gadamer and another really important figure
Yeah.
in this whole discussion, E.D. Hirsch.
Right.
And he focuses on, what they saw as this kind of primary goal of interpretation, right?
Right.
So Gadamer is really focused on the truth
The truth.
that can come out of interpretation, right? Whereas Hirsch is more focused on meaning.
Meaning. Yeah.
And in particular, the author's intended meaning.
Yes. The author's intended meaning.
So how does that play out? Like, what are the implications of that difference?
Well, Gadamer argued that historicism, in its pursuit of kind of objective historical understanding, essentially forces a text to give up its claim to truth
Okay.
by treating it as merely a historical artifact.
Okay. So by just focusing on the historical context, you might miss the truth.
You might miss the truth.
Yeah.
That's relevant to us today.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Hirsch, on the other hand.
He comes from more of a Kantian perspective.
Okay.
And he argues that we should treat the words of others, and therefore their intended meaning,
What?
as valuable in themselves,
Okay.
not just as tools for our own interpretations.
Okay.
So he thinks that respecting the author involves trying to accurately grasp what they meant to convey.
Okay. So for Gadamer, the truth
The truth can kind of
emerges out of it.
emerge out of the encounter.
Yeah.